Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. But I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar, which is really based on the latest report that the ITJP has produced on Chemmani, which is titled "We Are Still Searching." Today, we're simply not discussing the discovery of hundreds of human remains, but rather we're
Sorry,
discussing.
Yasmin, I'm just checking. Okay, yes, we are live. You can continue. Apologies.
Thank you. So today, we're not simply discussing the discovery of hundreds of human remains, we're discussing 30 years of unanswered questions. Chemmani is about mothers, fathers, wives, husbands, and children who have spent decades searching for the truth. And so the excavation is not the end of the story, it's the beginning, really, of the search for accountability. We have three eminent speakers who are joining us today. Mr. Ratnavale, who's an eminent human rights lawyer practicing in Sri Lanka and who is from the CHRD, who have in fact put Chemmani on the map and who have been dealing for decades with atrocity crimes and supporting families in their quest for justice. We also have Ingrid Masaji, the chairperson of the Sri Lanka campaign, an INGO operating out of the United Kingdom. And Ingrid, of course, also worked for Amnesty for many years on Sri Lanka. And then I'm also pleased that we have Johan Sufi, who's the head of the Sri Lanka Accountability Program in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and who's currently also working on a report on Sri Lanka. So without much ado, I'm going to turn to Mr. Ratnavale. Mr. Ratnavale, when people think about mass graves, they often think about isolated killings. But in fact, my question is whether Chemmani instead points to something much larger, an organized system of detention, disappearance, and disposal of bodies. And if we think that that proposition is correct, what evidence, in fact, leads us to that conclusion? And what does Chemmani actually tell
Can I
us
actually tell
about the
us
nature
about
of the
the nature
crimes?
of crimes?
Thank you, Yasmin, for the introduction, and also I wish to thank the ITJP for bringing out this very wonderful and informative report. We are still searching on Chemmani, and Chemmani has a special place in the annals of Sri Lanka because it points to very serious type of atrocities which have been committed against civilians. And as you stated, Yasmin, this is not an isolated incident, but it has been a concerted and premeditated sort of killings for quite some time. This particular location was actually brought to the notice of the entire world by a army soldier himself who was implicated in the incident. When he was convicted for the offense of rape, abduction and rape of the famous Krishanti Kumarasamy, he came out with the information in court itself saying that there are graves, mass graves containing bodies which had been, the murder had been committed by the armed personnel themselves. And he specially mentioned the sort of chain of command, that is, superiors were responsible for it. And thereafter, that was in the year 1998. 3rd of July 1998, when he was convicted by a court, by the High Court, for the abduction murder of Krishanti Kumarasamy, he revealed that there are locations. Then immediately investigations were commenced, and the excavation process started. However, it came to a sort of halt in the year 2000 because of, I think, apathy on the part of the Attorney General. I think it was orchestrated, it was deliberately stalled. However, and the world had forgotten about that for quite some time. But 26 years or 25 years thereafter, in the year 2025, in the month of February, when the local government body was preparing to modernize the cemetery in Chemmani, they came across, when they were digging, they came across bones and human skeletons. And thereafter, it was handed over to the magistrate of Jaffna, and the excavations had commenced under the supervision of the court. And from then onwards, it had been a sort of continuous excavation of skeletons. Now, after nearly more than 1 year, there have been discovered about 479 human remains, about which I think daily reports have been published. However, it points out to the fact that it had been a deliberate act over so many years. Now, if I can start from the year 1996, where the area of Jaffna had been recaptured by the Sri Lankan army. And it had been under the control, the area had been under the control of the Sri Lankan army there onwards. So there is no opportunity for any other organization or any other persons to have committed such enormous crimes without the knowledge of the Sri Lankan army. Now, in 1996, the area surrounding the Chemmani cemetery was controlled by the army, and there were camps. There was a main camp and there were satellite camps around that. And Chemmani is a Hindu cemetery where they actually, according to Hindu traditions, they cremate. Hindus do not bury the dead bodies of their beloved. So it's entirely mysterious that there have been such human remains that have been discovered from there. So it all points out to some extraneous activity and crime, scene of crime, because nobody can explain the human remains coming up in that area. And also, while the excavation had been done, the bodies had been scattered. In a sense, it was not a normal burial, normal or dignified burial. It's all scattered, and the way it had been done, one about the other, it does not point out to ordinary burial grounds. So the court had declared it as a crime scene, and there have been medical officers, forensic experts, forensic anthropologists, and several others who have been involved in the excavation. And on the ground, there have been medical students who have volunteered to do the work. And as you see it, if you come on the spot, you can see that it's a very laborious process.
Yeah.
It's not a sort of excavation that is ordinary. You have to be very careful, inch by inch, they do it. So it's a very massive type of work,
Yeah.
and so far it has been conducted in the proper way as far as possible, even though there have been some sort of hiccups from the establishment side. Work has been going on, and it all points out to the fact that when the army was in control from 1996, there had been no other entity which could have been responsible for this.
Yeah.
And although about 9 soldiers were indicted and 7 of them were convicted, they were all ordinary
Yeah.
soldiers, no
Yeah.
higher ups, no generals or anybody had been sort of implicated or had been charged. And it all points to the fact that the persons who were really involved have let themselves sort of go, letting the small fry
Take
to
responsibility.
suffer, yes, take the
Yeah.
consequences. And given the long history of the impunity in Sri Lanka, this is not surprising. So the people, the victims, the victim families are, however, they are very intent, and they have requested the authorities to go on with the excavations, and also they want the truth to come out, and the victims, they have they have been very consistent throughout. They stand by the sort of lawyers who are spearheading this, and they have no faith in the official sort of, including the office of the missing persons.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ratnavale. I mean, you've highlighted, I think, some very important issues. The one is the continuing nature of, the bodies being buried at Chemmani, the fact that really the only people who've ever been in control of that site have been the security forces. And even though, excavations are being carried out and forensic work is being done, there is a big question around accountability and particularly chain of command accountability. And I think in that context, I'm going to come back later on to this question of, in that kind of context, what does justice then mean for the victims? You've pointed to the fact that you did have foot soldiers indicted and convicted, but at the end of the day, it hasn't really addressed those who are ultimately in command of the situation. And so hold that thought, because I think we're going to come back to that later on. Ingrid, turning to you, you've been involved for a long time in monitoring what's been going on. And so I want to ask you this question. What makes the current excavation different from what has happened before in 1995? And what opportunities exist now that were missed then?
Thank you, Yasmin. Excellent questions. I will do my best to answer them. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind is that the exhumations in 99 was during a time when the war was still ongoing, whereas now there is no conflict, at least not an armed conflict of such. So one would hope that that makes a more conducive environment for proper truth and justice processes to take place. The just the sheer number, I mean, there was 15 exhumations in 99. We're talking about nearly 500 now. It's a completely different scale. So the operation it needs to be handled differently purely on that basis. The other thing that really strikes me is that, and please, Mr. Ratnavel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have the impression that so far The criminal investigation has just not started. In 99, we had the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, already, while the examinations were ongoing, they already started their investigations. In total, in fact, they interviewed more than 300 witnesses and took 400 plus statements. So unfortunately, of course, afterwards, the whole dossier now seems to have been lost, but that's another matter. But I'm rather worried that when the Minister of Justice recently visited Chemmani, he also said no names of perpetrators are known. So there he seemed to imply, therefore, there's no need to have a criminal investigation, which I found rather shocking. Because, of course, we remember that in 2003, I think, the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka put this committee together under Devanesan Nesaya, and they did a very thorough interviews with relatives and witnesses and so on, and they managed to identify 35 names of perpetrators. That report is available, and even the interviews that they did with perpetrators and witnesses, one would hope they are, the documents are still accessible within the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka's archives, or otherwise I would hope in the UNDP archives, as UNDP were the funders of that particular work. The other difference is, at least in 99, there were expert observers. And I don't count myself as an expert, but I was there accompanying forensic archaeologists and pathologists on behalf of Amnesty. Then Physicians for Human Rights also had sent their expert, and I think there was a couple of others as well, Asia Commission for Human Rights, if I remember correctly. It's a difference in terms of they were observing, but they were not allowed to sort of interfere or participate in any way in the exhumations. Now we're having the odd visit by diplomats, like we recently had the EU delegation up there. We've had the High Commissioner there, of course, in June last year, if I remember correctly. But no actual forensic experts, international forensic experts observing, or indeed, one would hope, participating. The role of the Attorney General, Mr. Ratnavel, has already pointed to that. I think it's a key one, in the sense of they were really quite obstructive back during Chemmani 1. One would hope that this long-awaited independent public prosecutor's office would finally be set up, and that maybe we would have people in there that would genuinely be committed to trying to bring prosecutions for those against whom there is sufficient evidence. Otherwise, technically, no ante-mortem data collected, not then, not now, again, as far as I understand. No DNA samples taken, not then, not now. The other thing, of course, is technology has moved on a lot. So now, of course, we have ground penetrating radar systems, and also in terms of the forensic identification, there is much more potential, but Sri Lanka has no expertise to speak of in that field. And, so there are plenty of other places around the country where bodies are just being piled up and have been, like in Matale, for more than 10 years, and nothing is happening with them. So, yeah.
You raise very important points. And I think that, this goes to the heart of the question of accountability. And in fact, whether, criminal accountability for these crimes can in fact be dealt with domestically, which I think is a consideration that's on the table. Before I go to Johan, though, just a reminder to the audience that you can actually put your questions into the chat, And at the end of the discussion, we will take them and give them to our presenters to respond to. So, Johan, in this kind of context, the process is very important in terms of excavating and exhuming. The forensic work, the DNA, the notion of experts, I think is quite critical. And I think we are at a point where we need to talk about this chain of command issue, and of course the question of command responsibility. Um, you're an international lawyer of some note. I mean, working in the SLAP is not your first venture actually into this field. You've done incredible work along your career, and I'm just wondering, from an international law perspective, how would you qualify the situation here? And what steps would you take to ensure that the evidentiary aspects of Chemmani are in fact collected, documented, preserved, so that they can form the basis for a case in the future? And what would you say is the role of SLAP and OHCHR in really promoting accountability for crimes of this nature, where I think the preservation of the site is one thing, but given that we already have a list of almost 35 perpetrators and probably could go much more if we start to go upwards, what would your recommendations then be? Long question.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Yeah, not only long question, but a lot of questions which could cover almost all the times we are allocated. But first, let me echo also the thanks to ITGP, but beyond you to all the victims and survivors that just continue to fight daily after all that time, so that the memory of the disappeared and is not lost, but also that justice and accountability is promoted. And just to say also that OHCHR, but OSLAP in particular, will always be alongside victim and survivor. Now, this being said, let me answer your question. And the first thing is, I want to echo what has been said before, that excavation does not mean investigation. These are two different matters. Excavation is to retrieve body from a ground and give them a proper and decent, funerals and respectful last place of resting in a way. Investigation is to know what happened, when, and by whom. And that's exactly, I think, what all the speakers have been pointing out today. The other aspect of this question is, once you've established this fact, is to put a legal qualification to that. And you're asking me this question. I'm not a judge, neither in Sri Lanka nor in an international court. So it would be speculative for me to put a legal definition before having seen the evidence. I mean, no lawyers would ever do that, but that's why I call for an investigation and not only excavation. This being said, what I can say though is that, two things have been mentioned. The first one is the nature of the information. I will not talk about evidence, the information that is already coming out from Chemmani. What makes the difference between a criminal investigation and someone who died and who have been buried is the nature of the death. Is it lawful? Is it natural? Or is it not? And that's the first and important question we need to answer. The nature of the information that seems to come from Chemmani is that, at least for a significant part, these have not been natural death. And, a lot has been cited, the age of potential victims or people who are buried there, the fact that we found some artifacts, the fact that some people could have been even tied. Of course, the number, mass grave is very rare, and there is natural cause of death, because families want a decent, burial for their loved ones. So usually mass grave with almost, as it has been said, 500 people points toward crimes. But more importantly, the fact that there is a statement by alleged co-perpetrators who've said, we've killed people and we've buried them. So all the elements to trigger a criminal investigation and to believe that there is a prima facie evidence of crimes are there. That's, I think, a first part of the question. The second part is, and that's my lawyer's heart here, which I put, is what is the definition, what is the legal qualification of the crime? To a certain extent, the difference between a domestic murder, a war crimes, a crimes against humanity, or any other legal qualification depends on the context of the crime. And so, for example, a murder, a single murder or a single act of torture in a domestic context will be a legal qualification of murder pursuant to the Domestic Criminal Code. A war crime is a murder against a civilian by a combatant that is done in the context of an armed conflict, which was the case, as it has been recalled at the time, in Sri Lanka. A crime against humanity is the same crime, the same murder, the same torture, sexual violence made in the context of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population. So Chemmani, to a certain extent, has already some aspect of that. And what I want to say also is that don't trust my word as a lawyer. Trust the word of the OHCHR investigation in Sri Lanka in 2015 already, which say that enforced disappearance have been prima facie, or there are reasonable grounds to believe that this was part of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population, which would be the chapeau element for crime against humanity. So now to answer your question concretely, what does that mean? First, that there is prima facie element that points toward crimes which require criminal investigation. And so not only excavation. And it changes everything. The way you address the crime scene is not the same way you address, someone who has died of natural cause. Of course, you need forensic. Of course, you need DNA. Of course, you need to protect and secure also the crime scene for possible tampering, because there is possible evidence there that's going to link to perpetrators beyond the direct perpetrator. And that leads me to the last point of your question, which is the other concrete consequence. The other concrete consequence is the state has a duty to act. And when I say to act, is not only to investigate, but also to prosecute the commanders who were in charge of these mass crimes and who did not prevent or punish the crime. And so this needs to be done. And I think that's what the victims have been calling for decades now. And that's what OSLAP and OHCHR more broadly has been called also for again and again, and what is trying to support also in its daily activities. And I'll be happy to expand more on that if there are questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Johan. I think between all three of you, you've really pointed to the fact that, more bodies were found. We also know that some of the bodies were found in a position where it was quite clear that their hands were and arms were bound. We also know that, most people, particularly amongst the, Tamil people, they would never bury bodies. They would cremate. And so the fact that these bodies were found, I think, is a big challenge. And then, of course, given the fact that the Minister of Justice visited the site and said that they have no documents and no records, I think that's really problematic. And, Mr. Ratnavale, when one thinks about the fact that this is really a site of continuing, crimes, really. What would you say is, in a way, the reason for this kind of impunity? Because, as Ingrid pointed out, when you look at the first investigations, they were actually tackled in a different way. The CID were involved, and it was really done with on the basis that they would, in fact, want to find out who's responsible. And that, of course, led then, besides the confession, it also led to the indictment and, of course, conviction. Now, we don't have this at this point. And in the absence of a special prosecutor's office, which has not yet been set up, what do you think are the opportunities really for justice for the victims? And what do they actually see as what, is the truth enough for them? Or are they going to need something more? As you yourself pointed out when you began, many of them speak about the fact that those who were convicted are foot soldiers. And given that the army was in control of the area, there has been no other intervention, what are their expectations?
Well, Sri Lanka has a long history of impunity and the armed forces committing crimes against humanity. In this background, I think there is actually no instance of any soldiers having been convicted, except in the case of Biriswil mass murder, where 7 civilians had been killed and a few soldiers had been indicted and convicted. But other than that, we don't find instances of official investigation and criminal charges being held against the high officials who had been responsible, who had been the commanding officers. Now, wherever you see, it's, as you said, it's the foot soldiers who had been charged. And in most cases, like in the Kumarapuram massacre, which happened in the 1990s, all of them had been, although they have been charged, none of them had been convicted. And there have been several instances like mass murders, apart from the Chemmani incident. There have been Kumarapuram, Kokatticholai, Veerapuram, and some of them had never come to light, although there had been discovered mass burials. So far, investigations had not been conducted, and no criminal investigation was conducted, and none of them were made responsible. Although the local people who were aware of those incidents, they were prepared to point out to the officers. They had identified the officers. However, no action had been taken. For example, in the famous Vandarmulai in the eastern province, more than 100 civilians, residents of a village, had been rounded up in one particular day, and thereafter they disappeared. And the people were all aware of the identity of the perpetrators. They were able to name even the commanding officers and others who were involved, but so far nothing has happened. The criminal investigation had not been conducted. So there are so many instances like that. That's why the people have no faith in the
Criminal
local investigations, and they are calling for international investigations. However, whether it's practical or not, it points out to the frustration of the victim families. So therefore, we can very safely state that the government, the establishment, is not going to very easily initiate any investigation, meaningful investigation. As the minister himself says, there are no particular evidence. It may even point out to LTT and things like that. But he cannot say simply like that, because it is off record that the army was in control and the LTT combat forces had been sort of had withdrawn from that area. It was only the Sri Lankan forces who were in control.
Yeah.
Therefore, there is not much sort of, if actually a genuine investigation could be launched, it's not going to be difficult to point out to the persons who are involved, the chain of the
Command.
hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yes. All that could be, it's off record, and it's not a difficult thing. Only the will is missing. But as Johan said, the criminal investigations could begin with that.
Yeah. Thanks, Mr. Ratnabel. I mean, you're raising you're raising very interesting points. There's quite an echo. You're raising very interesting points. And I just wonder, given the fact that even the institutions in Sri Lanka, which are really meant to support accountability, for instance, the Office of Missing Persons, you look at the Human Rights Commission, and while we see, I think, a lot of work being done around economic crimes, the reality is, of course, that in terms of the crimes, that occurred in the context of the war and in its aftermath, you actually see no accountability at all. It's also very clear that when you look at the kind of criminal accountability investigation that needs to be done, I'm not sure that Sri Lanka has that capacity and, in fact, the kind of technical expertise that is going to be needed to do this. And so in that context, Ingrid, perhaps I can pose a question to you about what do you think needs to happen going forward? Because quite clearly, I mean, you've talked about the fact that technology has advanced, but you can only begin to do that when you distinguish really between excavation and taking bodies out of the ground, and the fact that the way in which you begin to do that, in fact, supports an investigation in which the evidence is very carefully collected and preserved. And of course, to assist with that, and we know that that's been the plea by many human rights groups, that you need forensic and DNA support as well. So in that context going forward, what do you think needs to be done? And how can the international community, in fact, support that? Because we need to get to a point where you can establish this chain of command and, in fact, prosecute those who are responsible. But in the context of a country where there's been no security sector reform, how does one proceed?
Yeah, indeed. Good question. If I was one of the members of the army, who was deployed in that area at the time, with this exhumation that have been going on for the last few months, I would have left the country, or at least tried to leave the country. So, failure most likely has already happened. That, the first thing that should have been done was get that list of 35 perpetrators, alleged perpetrators, that the committee of the Human Rights Commission had identified, at least take their passports away so they can't leave the country, but also start questioning them, start detaining them if indeed it becomes clear that they have had a major role. It's extremely worrying that that hasn't happened after such a long time. And we're talking about this new government, nearly 2 years in power now, but still, who promised system change, but we're not seeing system change whatsoever. It's business as usual, and the lack of political will, unfortunately, seems pretty evident to me.
Yeah. Which brings me, Johan, to a question for you. I think that we've had a lot of UN bodies go to Sri Lanka, and in fact, you also had the High Commissioner's visit to Sri Lanka. And, when one looks at the statements that have emerged from that, the government's kind of promised to deal with accountability, but I think we haven't seen anything concrete yet. For victims also, they and their families, they don't really trust the domestic system. And we know that the discussion around a special office of prosecutor did take place, but we haven't seen any advances on that point. And so, from the perspective of your particular project, which is really about accountability, what do you think can be done? And how can your office actually support the families of victims to actually access justice in this point? Because, we also have the erosion of sites. And, evidence disappears after a while. And so, really, we're also in a very small window of time when one can actually do something concrete. What would your advice be, and what do you think? How does that link also to the report that you are going to be delivering, I think, around September?
Thank you very much again for this question, Yasmin. I think it is my duty also to, show how OHCHR and OSLAP in particular can support such process, because I do believe, and I know also, that justice delayed is justice denied. You've mentioned it, because the evidence is tempered, because victims and perpetrators alike disappear or died, because they can, leave the country, but also just memory faints sometimes. And, the more time passes, the least justice is a credible outcome. And my project is fully dedicated to obtaining justice for victims and survivors. At the same time, I know the expectation and the despair by victims, etc. But OHCHR is not an international court. OHCHR is not an almighty mechanism that have the power to enforce justice. And more importantly, as you said, justice first needs to come where it counts, where it matters, where the victims are, where the crime scene is. And by experience also, you've mentioned, I've worked in this field of international justice for 20 years. Even when you have an international body, when they don't have access to the crime scene, when they don't have the cooperation of the authorities, it's always extremely complex. So to answer your question very concretely, I think the first responsibility foremost, stands with national authorities, and OHCHR. What they can do is to continue to advocate for it. And that's what we do in the upcoming report of the High Commissioner to the Human Rights Council about the current state of human rights in Sri Lanka, but also by publishing the report the same way we do it. We've done it for conflict-related sexual violence, which was very linked actually to Chemmani, because one of the emblematic case that has been mentioned, Krishani, was already mentioned in our report. So that's part of the advocacy. But also in the upcoming report, we hope to publish a brief on attacks against humanitarians. Although it's not directly linked to this crime, it's linked to the widespread and systematic campaign that we were mentioning. So it's important also, I think, when we talk about accountability, not to take crimes in silos. The more you go up the chain of command, the more the responsibility is for the crime in their entirety. So that's also to keep in mind. I think more concretely, OHCHR and the UN in general can also offer a form of expertise that might be lacking. We are talking about forensic expertise. For example, you perhaps know that there is a Minnesota protocol that also address the way that mass graves should be handled, that excavation should be handled in consistent with best practices. And I think it's important also that when there is either lack of expertise or just question about, sometimes it's very hard. I mean, sometimes it's not, but sometimes it's hard to distinguish between lack of will and lack of capacity. And I think that it's always good also, while respecting sovereignty, to sometimes reach out and say, how can we benefit also from the expertise of other people who've worked in Colombia, who've worked in other parts of the world where this kind of work has been done also. So I think that's also where the office in general and OSLAP can offer some support. But I think immediately our role is really also, as we said, to collect and preserve and work on the accountability part. So as of today, we have, and I don't like to cite figures because we're still looking also for duplicates, etc. But let's say around 120,000, 125,000, material that we are collecting, we are analyzing, including on Chemmani. And we are doing this work that we are calling for, of trying to link, okay, these people have disappeared in this area. Who was a commander at the time? What was a unit which had control over the... And this we can offer also support, when there is lack of capacity. That's something we can bring. Also because, and again, I've seen that in my career, investigating mass crimes is sometimes very different to investigate a single rape the same way it has been done, for example, for the murder and the rape of Crescenti. So I think that's very important also to reach out and to say, how can we see now these crimes in its globality and how can we address that? I think we can offer support in that regard. But again, as I said earlier in the introduction, I think first and foremost, our role is to be the voice there with the victims, with the organization of civil society to keep the accountability agenda alive, both before, like in Sri Lanka, and before the Human Rights Council. And that's also what we are trying to do, including with me participating in this great discussion today.
Thank you, Johan. Mr. Ratnavale, I think you probably know more about this situation than anybody else because you've been at it for such a long time. What do you think are the prospects for, a proper criminal investigation, which will not only look at the individual role players, but will also look at this question of command responsibility and the chain of command? And is there a prospect for bringing a case on behalf of victims in Sri Lanka at a domestic level?
Well, as things go, the excavation is one thing and investigation is another. So excavation is being conducted and hopefully there could be investigation. However, the command responsibility has to be looked into, and going by the conduct of the government regarding this is very disappointing. We have named several army generals, colonels who have been implicated in this matter. However, no action had been taken against them. Instead, they have been rewarded. They had been promoted to various positions. Some of them had been sent as ambassadors, high commissioners, and the Sri Lankan army, they had been rewarded by being sent as peacekeeping forces to other countries. So in this context, it's difficult to state whether the government, any government which comes to power, is prepared to conduct these investigations and based on the command responsibility chain of command, whether these persons could be prosecuted. However, in the present context, in the background that there had been high-profile corruption cases which had been investigated, and several leading politicians have been implicated, they had been charged. I think there is hope that the investigations could be commenced and under the present dispensation, things might change. And one welcome sort of development is that the CID is also part of the investigation, and they are, to a certain extent, they have commenced the investigation. However, things are moving in a very slow pace. Well, about more than 20 years have lapsed, and during that time, the witnesses, either they have there may be fading memories, or they may have died. They are no more, and the evidence may also may not be that sort of readily available, because of, there's 2 decades have passed. So in this background, it's, I think, essential that we speed up the process, and there should be willingness on the part of the government, and for that to happen, I think there has to be some external pressure, and from the United Nations mechanism, and where other organizations could play a part in this.
Yeah, thank you very much, because I think it goes directly to this question of, are we talking about political will, or are we talking about, the technical capacity issue? And it almost seems to be a mixture of both. On the one hand, we have seen this administration really begin to look at the question of fraud and corruption, but we haven't seen the same kind of zeal in dealing with the gross human rights violations. And that link between economic crimes and the human rights violations issue, that always seems to be a bit of a challenge. So, Ingrid, let me come to you then. What do you think we can do? What should the international community do to, in fact, support this quest for accountability? Mr. Ratnavale's mentioned that, yes, the CID are involved, but we are also in this race against time, not just in terms of the evidence, but also in terms of the human beings. And at the same time, we're also seeing that this administration is promoting people who are implicated in violations, sending them abroad as ambassadors, sending them as part of peacekeeping, and yet we've seen very little happen. So what do you think the international community can do to, in fact, I think, raise these questions with the government so that we see more progress on the matter?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I guess we have the Human Rights Council starting again fairly soon at the end of August, beginning of September. Sri Lanka won't feature that prominently. Of kind of the key session on Sri Lanka will be next year in September. But nevertheless, one would hope that there are opportunities during the council for the international community to raise the exhumation-related concerns in Chemmani, and keep Sri Lanka on the agenda, however much else is going on in the world. The special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, summary executions, has been requesting to visit Sri Lanka for quite some time, He's an Argentinian forensic expert. He has years and decades of experience in this field. I mean, I would say the international community must make that a condition qua non, that he has to be there and be allowed to visit the site and discuss with the local experts how to move forward and provide technical assistance in a very practical way, because exactly that's his background. He has done it. He's got the T-shirt. And yeah, you mentioned peacekeeping. I mean, hats off to ITJP for including names of officers and senior commanders involved in Chemmani, and indeed for exposing that at least 2 of them were sent to Haiti and were then involved in sexual violence there. That is another factor that I would say the international community has to step up and do much more rigorous vetting of people, I mean, if any Sri Lankan army people should be sent on peacekeeping, but at least those who are sent should be properly vetted, so they're not rewarded for some of the crimes that they have committed.
Yeah. Thanks, Ingrid. Johan, I guess in this question of keeping Sri Lanka on the agenda of the international community, it seems to me that this may be the only way to ensure that the conversation around accountability remains on the agenda. And what do you think needs to be done to ensure that even though this is not the year when there will be a full-scale report, at the same time, how can we ensure that in the High Commissioner's observations that he makes to the Human Rights Council, how do we actually, get to deal with that? After you respond, then I'm going to ask Aura to tell me about the questions that we do have, and I'll give everybody an opportunity to respond to them. But Johan, let me go to you first.
Thanks, Yasmin. It's a tough question, but I believe that impunity is a disease in a way, but it's a very specific disease because it's contagious. It's contagious in the country, it's contagious throughout the time, throughout the space. And the only way, like any kind of epidemic, to fight this disease is through team effort. It's a collective responsibility. People who believe that because the crime did not directly touch them, that they will never be affected somehow by impunity, are mistaken and will discover it somehow. And I think that links also to what was said, that there is a direct link between impunity for past crimes, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and economic crimes or corruption. Yes, victims are different, but the nature of the thinking process is the same. It's basically a law without rules, a law without order. And that's why I say also, it has no border. It exports in Haiti, it exports everywhere in the world. And I think to a certain extent, when you ask me what can we do, we're trying to demonstrate that. One way, for example, we try to demonstrate, and that's why I want also to make a point about this collective effort. What everybody has to understand, we play in the same team, we just don't have the same roles. Yeah. And so when sometimes, and I take the criticism, victims might think that we're not doing enough, or we're not sufficiently vocal. It's because we have also a different role. We have access to states, we have access to the Human Rights Council. And so we try to work in that regard, but we need victims, we need NGOs to be also doing their part of the core, if I can say so. I'll give you a very tiny example and then I close. We're going to celebrate on the 4th of August, the 20th anniversary of the murder of 17 members of Action Contre la Faim. 20 years of impunity. We know more or less you know, that it was state responsibility, that the state have committed this crime. Still 20 years later, while attacks against humanitarian is again not only on the agenda of the international community, but that we witness that everywhere in the world, I think to a certain extent the Sri Lanka precedent set a bad record. So that's why I really want, you know, to be next to the NGOs, be with OHCHR, with OSLAP, to be together and to, you know, defend this agenda of fighting impunity with our different role, with our different access, etc. But that's basically this team effort that's going to ensure that one day at least we have some form of justice or accountability, or even starting by the truth.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. We do have a few questions, and so I'll beg the indulgence of another 10 minutes from everybody. The first question is from Mr. Kandya, and he says, and this is a question of political will, a real demonstration of political will. While the Sri Lankan government is investigating so much time and energy in investigating the Easter bombing, why are they ignoring the crimes committed against Tamils and, of course, which in his view amounted to genocide? A second question very much related to that says, this is the evidence of how brutal Sri Lankan governments have acted against Tamils in our homeland. We knew they won't investigate properly, and we need international investigations and justice for those who brutally massacred so many of our people. And there was another question, Mr. Ratnavale, directed to you. Could you speak to the trauma question for the families and lawyers who are watching the exhumations? And also a very important question, the security of those involved. And you know, I guess the backdrop that we're also operating under is that at an international level, you have a number of very powerful countries who are selectively dismantling the international criminal justice system. And you have the USA openly advocating for a complete decimation of the International Criminal Court. And in that context, even though we have long established norms and standards, it's then incredibly difficult for you know, people to operate. So I think those were the bulk of the questions, and I'll come back to each of you for a final comment. But I'll start with you, Mr. Ratnavale. You've heard the question. So government has demonstrated political will in one instance, but not in others.
Thank you, Yasmin. And the question, the first, I think the part of it is when the government had investigated or completed investigation the Easter Sunday, why not the crimes against the Tamil people? Well, at this moment, we cannot confidently state that the Easter Sunday incident had been properly investigated, because 24 persons have been arrested, they have been indicted, charged, and there's a trial at bar, before the trial at bar. However, the so-called mastermind was arrested, that is Saleh, Suresh Saleh had been arrested only much later, and he has not been connected to this particular case yet. Ironically, the case before the trial at bar, Suresh Saleh was listed as the witness number 1 for the prosecution. A person who should have been in the dock as the first accused was listed as prosecution witness number 1. So from that itself, we could imagine that, and that indicates how the investigation had been conducted in a very partial manner, excluding the real perpetrators. And Suresh Saleh had been the mastermind, along with, I mean, he had been listed to do the dirty work of the earlier defense secretary and who later
Yeah.
became the president. So at that high level, things had not been satisfactorily investigated. And that is the same in respect of the Tamil people who had been facing such atrocities for the last several decades, maybe for the last 40, 50 years. So no satisfactory investigation has been conducted in any instance. So there is a total lack of political will combined with extreme impunity for the persons who had been, for the perpetrators.
Yeah.
So that points out not only to the lack of political will, but also attitude, the psyche of the persons who are in power.
Yeah.
Well, we can say that the Sri Lankan, the state or the entire country has now become the sort of, it has been led to a position where the military has been extended a very unique place in the society. They have been pampered. In each and every budget each year, the military expenditure had been quite high. It has increased to a level that it is now, I think, mostly more than 18 or 20% of the total budget. And also, the military has been the generals have been extended favors. They are in the thick of big business. They are running hotels and various high-powered businesses. So, and the military has become a sort of exclusive sort of sector. And if I could say so, in the south, that among the Sinhalese society, in each and every family, there is a military personnel. Not only military, when you take a family, one son may be in the army, another son may be in the navy, another person in the police, so that it has become this military sector, security sector has become a hunting ground for to award employment opportunities.
Yeah.
And they have been a pampered lot. So
Yeah.
it may, in the long run, it will affect the society definitely, because without the military sort of sanction or permission, businesses cannot be run, and
Yeah.
even the politicians will be at the mercy of the military bigwigs. So it all points out to the fact that military has got a very the stranglehold over the society, even without the people knowing it, because they themselves fall a prey. They think they get good positions in the society, influential positions, but ultimately it's a society that will suffer.
Yeah. Mr. Ratnavale, one question to you that somebody posed in the chat, and that is that the question was, obviously the government is not interested in pursuing, these cases. And, there isn't an expectation that they're really going to do anything much around that. But, a question somebody asked is, why will CHRD, why do you not feel that you can also, file a case in the Sri Lankan courts against implicated high-ranking officers? If you could just touch very briefly on that.
Well, we have filed cases in the nature of habeas corpus, where the commanders have been named as parties. But those cases have been dragged along, and after quite some time, when a positive declaration had been made by the High Court stating that the army is finally responsible for the disappearances. The state, that is the Attorney General, had appealed against it, and now the appeal cases are pending in the Court of Appeal, and it takes a very long time for them to conclude. But other than that, knowing well that not only the lack of will, but also in the judicial context, not many cases have been successful. And these high-profile atrocities have not been committed with witnesses. Now, who are the witnesses when we say it will point out to the army personnel who were around there, who had been helping the actual perpetrators. So it will be difficult to get them to testify in favor of the victims. And that is the situation that we have been confronted throughout. So there is not much chance for high-profile cases being brought against the military personnel.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Ratnavale. A question for you is that, the current OSLAP international mechanism is inadequate to enforce anything other than keeping an international focus and advocacy alive. But Chemmani breaks the OSLAP mandate, and OSLAP still has no focus on addressing genocidal intent through the main Tamil political parties. And, their requests or demands have remained ignored so far. I guess the question, if one was to interpret it as, what can OSLAP do beyond just this question of, keeping the issue alive and filing reports, and how do you push it further towards investigation? And to some extent, that's also linked to a comment by Anandi Haka, who says that we want international investigations. So perhaps a final comment from you, Johan, and from you, Ingrid, as well, to that demand.
I think I've answered to a certain extent to that question before. We can collect, preserve, share also the evidence where we have a mandate to do. But, the key principle are also consent. So, for example, we share the evidence only when there is a clear consent to share with the country in question. So, for example, if a witness or source has provided us with a statement or document and say that they don't want to share with Sri Lanka, we just don't share with Sri Lanka or with any other country. I would say also a significant portion of the information or evidence we have, we cannot just share it with anyone because we don't have consent. So the only thing we can do is to preserve it, waiting also for a form of change in the context, and use it to the best we can for our advocacy, whether in report publicly or behind the scene, and so I understand and I hear the frustration. I mean, I share it to a certain extent. People have also to realize, and I know I've worked in courts with much more resources and a broader mandate where, you can at least issue an arrest warrant, or that's not, unfortunately, what OSLAP is. So we are trying our best. We are always welcoming also, and I think you've all seen we've held consultation for strategy that we've put online, that we are happy for people also to reach out, to comment, to say we disagree on that priority. With the limited resource and time you have, we believe you should focus on that. This is an exercise we've done and that we continue to do. And I invite everyone, perhaps I will put both the strategy or like the priorities for the next 2 years and to reach out, and that's what we can try to do. But if I can finish, I would just say, like, citing perhaps Martin Luther King, injustice somewhere is a threat to justice anywhere. And I truly believe that. And that's what really we're trying just to address.
Yeah, thank you. Ingrid, final comment?
Sure. I agree with Mr. Ratnavel that there clearly is a lack of political will, including during previous governments, but also seemingly, sadly, with this government. And it's very sad, particularly because the Tamils actually voted in large numbers for this government, believing that there was going to be system change. Again, I have to point out, time and again in the past, UMP, SLFP, other parties also used the Tamil votes, promised various things, and then didn't deliver. I guess it's kind of inherent in being a minority, but that doesn't justify it. I think one factor in this equation is indeed the way the Sri Lankan army seems to have built close ties with all the political parties, and has a lot of influence of how things are developed in respect of investigations like this, and more generally, in fact, in terms of in the security sector reform, there hasn't been hardly any of that at all. And no doubt, to my mind, that that's partly because of this power the army has over these political parties, one way or another.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. I mean, I think that we could go on probably discussing the issues that have emerged for much longer, but with all good things, we have to come to an end. And I want to say that, like, just listening to all of you and really looking at the report, Chemmani can't be seen in isolation. It has to be seen within the broader context of impunity and other atrocity crimes that were perpetrated in Sri Lanka, going right back actually to the JVP period, the civil conflict itself, and of course in the aftermath. And the fact that we've had successive governments who promised systems reforms, who promised accountability, and yet we have not seen any security sector reform, which makes it very difficult, as Mr. Ratnavel says, to actually file cases in the courts, bringing very powerful people down. And bearing in mind, you also have to build a constituency. And if you consider that when we look at probably people in the Sinhala community, most of them have relatives who are in the army. And the army, in fact, is very much a part of the society. And in that context, how do you build that kind of reform? But we have to say that I think it's a really big scandal that we've had these crimes. But the biggest scandal is also the 30 years of impunity, which has followed the Chemmani issue. And that really calls, I think, for action. And so I want to finish by saying that this is not a historical issue. This is very much a live issue which demands a proper criminal accountability investigation. And the excavations do create a renewed opportunity to investigate, to identify the victims, and to pursue criminal accountability, not only against the foot soldiers, but also to begin to track the chain of command. I think Johan also raised this question that their mandate is also about preservation. But I think the big question is also, how do we use the documentation that has been gathered? We don't want it to just gather dust. It's not enough to say it's there and it's safe. Yes, it's insurance, but at the end of the day, we have to think imaginatively of how we can pursue truth recovery and justice for victims. We didn't really have time to touch a very important question: trauma. trauma not only of the families of victims, but also the trauma of the lawyers and investigators who are sitting through this process. And perhaps that's the question that we will need to come back to at another time. But thank you, everybody, and thank you to my 3 guests who are very eloquent on the issue and very well informed. And let's have another webinar which actually looks at this question of trauma, which I think we just don't address sufficiently. But thank you, everybody, for putting this together, to Aura for getting all of the technology together, for all the dinosaurs like myself. And let's hope we all see you again. Thank you very much for participating.